Good afternoon, everybody. You can all hear me, even in the back? Great, perfect. Good afternoon. My name is Dr. James Herrera Brooks, and I serve as the Melanie Trent DeShutter Senior Director for Research and Publications here at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, and I am delighted to welcome you all today to this noontime lecture in our Scholar Series. As many of you know, we wish to acknowledge the generous support of Comrade Mercer Hall, who has endowed the VMHC's Scholar Series. Comrade serves as an honorary vice chair of the Board of Trustees of this institution, and he has been a champion of our work for decades. We also wish to acknowledge former VMHC President and CEO, Dr. Charles F. Bryan, Jr., whom this series also honors. Of course, as we mark Indigenous History Month, we wish to emphasize voices and histories too often left untold. Today's lecture deepens our understanding of the American Revolution by centering Indigenous resilience, sovereignty, and enduring influence on the founding and future of this nation. Just a couple of upcoming events before we begin today. The next time we meet here for a Scholar Series lecture will be the evening of November 20th at 6 p.m. when we welcome back former VMHC publications editor, Dr. Nelson D. Langford, for a talk on his latest book, After the Fire, Richmond in Defeat. That same weekend, please join us here at the VMHC, as well as at our neighbors, the VMFA, for the Pocahontas Reframed Festival, which works to raise awareness of Native American languages, cultures, contributions, and societies through films that center Indigenous perspectives. And now, as I move on to my introduction to today's speaker, I just want to give a brief reminder that we all check our mobile phones and make sure they are switched to silent, do not disturb, or are switched off. On July 4th, 1776, 200 miles northwest of Philadelphia, on indigenous land along the west branch of the Susquehanna River, a group of colonial squatters declared their independence. They were not alone in their efforts. This bold symbolic gesture was just a small part of a much broader and longer struggle in the North Susquehanna River Valley, where diverse peoples, especially indigenous nations, fought tenaciously to safeguard their rights, safeguard their lands, their rights, sovereignty, and survival. By intertwining the experience of Indigenous Americans, rebellious colonial squatters, opportunistic land speculators, and imperial government agents, today's speaker reveals how conflicts within and between them all set the terms and ultimately shaped the meaning of the American Revolution. In the crucible of this conflict, memories, histories, and animosities collided and converged with tremendous consequences. Today's talk delves into the racial violence over land and sovereignty that suffused the Revolutionary Age and helps restore indigenous peoples to their central position at the founding of the United States. Today's speaker, Dr. Christopher R. Pearl, is Associate Professor of History at Lycoming College, where he specializes in early American history and the American Revolution. He is the co-editor with Douglas Bradburn of From Independence to the U.S. Constitution, Reconsidering the Critical Period of American History, and the author of Conceived in Crisis, The Revolutionary Creation of an American State, as well as his latest book, Declarations of Independence, Indigenous Resilience, Colonial Rivalries, and the Cost of Revolution, which forms the basis of today's talk. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Christopher R. Pearl.
Can everybody hear me? I'm going to put this down. I'm a lot shorter than he is. But you all can hear me in the back? You're all good? All right, fantastic. Some say my voice carries, so that's good. I really appreciate that really gracious introduction, and thanks for everybody coming out today to hear a talk about my new book. I'm actually humbled to be here. So I'll start off where I start the book. On July 4th, 1776, as was just said, while Congress formally adopted the Declaration of Independence, maybe, There we go. There we are. Well, Congress formally adopted the Declaration of Independence in the city of Philadelphia, about 200 miles northwest. A group of squatters on indigenous land who had, over the previous few years, constructed their own independent yet interdependent fair play squatter government, collected together on the west branch of the Susquehanna River under a Dutch elm tree. That's there in that image. Later nicknamed by a folklorist, and this matters for part of my talk in a little bit, the Tyadotin elm. And supposedly they proclaimed, adopted, and perhaps signed their own Declaration of Independence, and they did so, according to legend, without knowing that Congress had done the same thing on the same day. Or so goes lore. That story has become so powerful, so ingrained into the memory of the American Revolution on the West Branch, that by the mid-20th century, Army engineers from Maryland made their way to the West Branch with a mine detector, attempting to find the lost declaration, which many believe the settlers buried in a metal strongbox, fearful of their proclaimed treason. By the 1960s, the Tyadotin Declaration, as it has come to be known, was still and is celebrated in the annual Tyadotin ceremony on July 4th. And those celebrations in the memory of the revolution on that branch of the Susquehanna are illuminating. If traveling there on that day in the 1960s, for example, you would have witnessed men walking through the town with hunting frocks and buckskin pants, flying the Gadsden Don't Tread on Me flag, to then reenact the signing of a local Declaration of Independence. If you travel back a little farther, you would have noticed that there was a small group of native peoples who had ancestral ties to the land. Today, that celebration endures, if in truncated form. But beyond the celebration, and this is what I found interesting because I live in this area, is if you ride down Route 220, which hugs much of the West Branch, you would encounter a host of memorials and historical markers dedicated to the telling of that, quote, founding history. There are two historical markers for the Tyadotin elm. You can see that there. I don't know why there are two. They have two different meanings, really. There are those signs demarcating those settlers' westernmost defense. There are signs marking places abandoned by settlers during what is popularly known as the Great Runaway, quote, burned by Indians, or markers memorializing famed, quote, Indian fighters, or those places where settlers were, quote, massacred by Indians. Nor are these markers mere relics of the mid-20th century. In 2013, I can't make this up. Has anybody ever watched this on Travel Channel, The Dead Files, before? Okay. So the Dead Files travel to Williamsport, Pennsylvania, investigating a quote-unquote demonic haunting. Yeah. And they go to the West Branch, and they make their way to this place that's known as the Plum Tree Massacre, which the Williamsport Gazette dubbed Ambush of Innocents. This was a massacre conducted according to lore and legend by a group of indigenous nations. But we have to remember those indigenous nations were there because there were squatters on their land during the war. And lo and behold, the Dead Files found that the demonic haunting is no less than an indigenous person. Particularly in this case, corn planter, which is shocking because corn planter is nowhere near this area during the revolution, right? And what I'm trying to point out by the Dead Files being there is that all of this collective memory that has become sort of history over the years continues to be part of the narrative, so this sort of settler-centric narrative. And it begs explanation. Not only do we need to know whether a group of squatters met there to declare independence, which a lot of people want to know if they actually did that, but also why they were there in the first place, and why their mere existence and their squatter claims created a situation in which the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court pointed out in 1791, and he's talking particularly about the area of the West Branch, quote, covered this country in blood. And while we have not found, and I don't think we will ever find, because I don't think it exists, a settler declaration of independence buried away somewhere on the West Branch, there are plenty of other documents nestled in archives throughout, really, the United States to reconstruct what happened there and why. For instance, it is clear in the historical record that more than 250 squatter families, that's roughly about 1,200 people, settled on indigenous land after about 1768. We can see that here in this example of a settler preemption application in 1784, in which, in the preemption application, if you look at the top, he's pointing out where his land, where he settled, and he clearly points out that he settled on, quote, Indian land. Just to make sense of this document, in 1784, so after the war and after the Treaty of Fort Stanwix with the Haudenosaunee, popularly known as the Iroquois, the Pennsylvania government granted the fair play settlers their, quote, preemption rights, or their squatter rights, for their once illegal claims. For the law stated their, quote, suffering and sacrifice during the war, which also meant necessarily the dispossession of the native peoples who lived and claimed that land. Not only do we have evidence that these settlers existed, but we have court records and other private papers directly related to the creation and function of the fair play government, what I call a squatter republic in the book. What is more is that we have evidence that those fair play settlers did meet on the plains of Pine Creek, with, quote, independence being all the talk. See if I can get that up. So you can see it here. They declared they're on the plains of Pine Creek, seeing such numbers flocking there and independence being all the talk. Moreover, the fact that they met together, I actually don't think is all that satisfying. What indeed did independence, liberty, and patriotism signify for those squatters on indigenous land? And equally crucial, what did it mean for the native peoples who also considered that land their home? Both, after all, experienced and participated in the American Revolution. That story is far more complicated and far messier than any memory, memorialization, historical marker, or modern celebration conveys. To really understand that story, we need to have a better grasp of the longer history of the region and the diversity of peoples who shaped the revolution there. Once we do that, we can see the sheer power, I think, of land, as well as generational grievances in shaping not just the American Revolution on the West Branch, but the founding of the United States. And I write this in the book. It's at the last line of the book, actually. The history of the Northern Susquehanna River Valley told here historicizes more than just an interesting local story, but a profoundly American one. After all, in the same documents explaining that fair play settlers met on the plains of Pine Creek are also testaments to the idea that the revolution meant far more than just independence from Britain. But it also, and critically, revolved around the removal of indigenous people from the land. As we can see here, maybe. No. Well, there's a document. It's not working. Oh, got it. There we go. And this is an important one for what I'm going to talk about today. In this document, a man named John Hamilton is writing on behalf of his father to get a pension. John Hamilton fought in the Revolutionary War aside his father, and he's applying for a pension through the federal government for his father, which would go to his mother, the then 80-year-old widow. And in it, he sort of points out that his name is preserved as one among others of his neighbors who held a meeting on the banks of Pine Creek on the 4th of July, 1776, and passed resolutions declaring themselves and the country free and independent of Great Britain. The remarkable coincidence of this with the National Declaration made it remembered. And he followed this up, and this is the important part. He followed it up in the very next sentence with, I have often heard my father say that in those exciting times, he had a great desire to kill an Indian. Right? So these two things are mutually reinforcing. They're not exclusive. And so that's idea, he said, and then he followed it up, that such a desire was far from being in harmony with his naturally amiable disposition, for he was an exemplary Christian. Nevertheless, his son quibbled, it must be remembered a spirit of liberty and patriotism pervaded the people. For this son, his father's participation in the Pine Creek Declaration of Independence and his desire to, quote, kill an Indian were equally important and mutually reinforcing in any understanding his father's dedication to liberty and patriotism, the lifeblood of the revolution. That connection, offered as a kind of disclaimer by the son of a fair play settler, nonetheless fueled the American Revolution in the Northern Susquehanna River Valley, and as it would turn out, what happened in the Northern Susquehanna River Valley, because of that relationship, would shape the war and the very meaning, I think, of the revolution itself. But how do we tell this sort of complex American story filled with what I call in the book a diversity of interests spanning several decades on either side of the sort of typical revolutionary timeline or periodization? I say this because John Hamilton's father did not want to just, quote, kill an Indian because of the revolution. But rather, that sentiment was directly related to a much longer history and experience that we need to grapple with and understand when we're thinking about the decisions and actions of people during the revolution. I think to start, we need to understand some basic realities about not just the West Branch, but the entire Northern Susquehanna River Valley, which is depicted here. Throughout the 18th century, but particularly by the 1740s, the Northern Susquehanna River Valley was a contested space. Not just between native peoples and British colonists, which is nonetheless critical, but within and between them all. Here, native nations fought between and among themselves for sovereignty, autonomy, and independence. White settlers clashed with land speculators, imperial agents, military officers, and even other white settlers who were also claiming, in various forms, their own independence and control of the region. In essence, all of these interests, where multiple peoples, groups, and nations proclaimed their independence, created a rather combustible situation, exploding during the American Revolution. The violence stemming from various declarations of independence then were not sudden. They were deeply rooted in a prolonged and intricate history. Rather than emerging from a period of peace, the Revolutionary War in the Susquehanna River Valley was just one significant episode in an enduring struggle over land, sovereignty, and independence involving Native Americans and European colonists that had been raging for well over 30 years. This protracted conflict was intimately connected to the American Revolution and its aftermath. Divergent memories, histories, and animosities shaped by experiences spanning generations converged, commingled, and clashed during this revolutionary struggle. And if you're looking at this map, and if you're interested in this map, the 1756 map, do you see if all the little homes that they're portraying on here? These are not settler homes, these are indigenous ones. For our purposes on the West Branch, which we're going to be talking a lot about, these are depictions of an indigenous settlement in a larger territorial zone that by the late 1760s, just probably that branch and down to Shamokin near Fort Augusta or Sunbury, there's about 7,000 native inhabitants here, okay? So that's kind of the world that we're talking about. It is not difficult to imagine why this place sparked such interest and violence. The Fair Play Republic, which would have existed on top of those indigenous towns, existed within a larger contested territorial zone. This zone was a perpetual battleground in the 18th century, witnessing relentless raids, counter raids between native nations and speculators and financiers and settlers, other colonies. And this expansive region spans most of present-day north-central Pennsylvania. So if you look down there at the bottom, that's Fort Augusta, and it runs up the East Branch, up the North Branch of the Susquehanna River, and then the West Branch moves that way. And that territory within is what we call the Northern Susquehanna River Valley, and it's encased, and this is something, if you've never been there, has anybody ever been there, this area? Yeah? Okay, excellent. So if you've never been there, it's encased between these things called endless mountains. And so if you're thinking, well, that's a great territory of land, it's actually not, because land is basically locked between mountains and creeks. And so it's a really narrow stretch of land if you're looking for fertile land, okay? And so that's why these settlements are so condensed along the rivers themselves. This area's history also transcends mere geographic boundaries like this. Positioned in the center of a rich and tangled history, the Northern Susquehanna River Valley was shaped by the struggle for land, sovereignty, and independence to the north, the home of the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and Tuscarora, who comprise the Six Nations, or the Haudenosaunee. Similar connections extended southeast to the Lehigh Valley and southwest beyond the Allegheny Mountains into the Ohio River Valley. Even a place as distant as Illinois had an impact on and was shaped by what was going on in the Northern Susquehanna River Valley. And by the mid-18th century, so by like 1749 really, where I start the book, this valley had captured the attention of people on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean, residing in diverse colonies, empires, and nations who were keenly interested and actively sought to control this area with force if necessary. Throughout the 18th century, the Northern Susquehanna River Valley was closely linked to these seemingly distant lands and peoples due to the rather diverse multinational population residing in it or vying for control of it. Indigenous refugees, displaced from their ancestral homes to the east, north, and south, found a home in this valley by 1749, particularly after the disastrous walking purchase of 1737, the Lenape, or Delaware. Displaced from their lands east and west, sought refuge and homes in the valley. Seeking refuge from racial violence, multi-ethnic indigenous Christians also sought solace in the valley after fleeing Moravian homes in the Lehigh Valley. Additionally, this place was a haven for refugee peoples, including Algonquin-speaking Nanticoke and Conoy from present-day Maryland, Shawnee from the south and west, and Mohican and Esopus from the northeast. Siouan-speaking Saponi and Tutelo from the Piedmont, along with a small group of Muskogean-speaking peoples from further south, also called this area their home. By the middle of the 18th century, these diverse groups either coexisted in multi-ethnic, multinational towns or lived as close but separate neighbors. There were multi-ethnic towns like Nescopec, Wyoming, and Wyalusing, which thrived along the north and east branches. Shamokin marks the forks, and Austinwacken, Wenchipachung, Great Island, Bald Eagle, and many other towns dotted the tributary creeks of the West Branch. In the 1720s, and then again in the 1750s, several multi-ethnic communities in that valley confederated, establishing their own councils, complete with diplomats, speakers, and interpreters, and asserted their claim over this entire area. Well, who are they asserting that claim from? Well, they are asserting it against other indigenous nations that claimed them as tributary peoples. The Northern Susquehanna River Valley, as I point out in the book, had a really dynamic social landscape as different peoples continually formed new associations, confederacies, alliances, and even shared spaces, envisioning sort of futures and collective futures at that. But despite their shared dreams, these communities retained their individual identities, lineages, histories, and sometimes even lingering animosities with each other. Like all dreams, these aspirations are not easily realized. The Haudenosaunee also asserted their claim to the Northern Susquehanna River Valley after the Beaver Wars of the 17th century, in which they quote-unquote conquered the Susquehannock. By the 1740s, the Haudenosaunee lived throughout these multinational villages, trying to establish control over the region. And they were trying to establish control over their region because they claimed a territory all the way down to the Tennessee River in Cherokee and Catawba country. And the Northern Susquehanna River Valley wasn't just valuable for its rich resources. It held strategic importance due to the Wyalusing, Shamokin, and Sheshquin paths that facilitated the movement of warriors, traders, and diplomats, and even missionaries along the Susquehanna River and its tributaries, connecting the region to both Onondaga in upstate New York, but also south into Cherokee and Catawba country. It is an access road that goes through this area. It's a crucial area to control. The Haudenosaunee and the Susquehanna nations, the Haudenosaunee also claimed the people that lived there, all those diverse people that I talk about, were their tributaries, their conquered women, children, cousins, nephews. And therefore, many of those supposed tributaries had been displaced to the Northern Susquehanna River Valley due to that perceived status. The Haudenosaunee were there with the walking purchase. The Haudenosaunee were there when the Conoy were removed. So the Haudenosaunee often agreed to these removal efforts and then moved these indigenous people into satellite towns as tributary peoples, as, quote, props of the Longhouse. But the Haudenosaunee, and whenever I give this talk, I'm like, this is so complex, and I try to break it down. The Haudenosaunee and the Susquehanna nations, those refugee peoples, are not the only indigenous peoples that lay claim here. The Ohio nations to the west, which are a multi-ethnic coalition of people, also lay claim to this area. They call it, quote unquote, their country. And they are also resisting Haudenosaunee control. And they're trying to establish they have kin networks already with the Susquehanna nations, but diplomatic relations with the Susquehanna nations as well. And many of them also take up seasonal residence in the Northern Susquehanna River Valley. And so when many people are talking about these areas and about these conflicts, they often talk about the Ohio River Valley, beyond the Allegheny Mountains, but this area is just as critical. And it's impossible for me to give you clear geographic boundaries, right? Like this is Lenape territory, or Shawnee, or Mohican, or Esopus, or Haudenosaunee, or Mingo, etc. And I could go on. Because, as even the Haudenosaunee claimed, quote, an abundance of Indians are moving up and down the river. Euro-American missionaries, as well as land-hungry speculators and settlers who traverse the valley, also couldn't help but comment on the, quote, mosaic of multi-ethnic Indian villages and individuals' farms that peppered the countryside. According to one missionary at the town of Shamokin, it's, quote, rare to hear two Indians talking in one language. While there was a struggle within and between the different Native American communities for control of and sovereignty over the Northern Susquehanna River Valley, Euro-Americans were also involved. And just like Native Americans, they fought between and amongst themselves. Separated by class, ethnicity, religion, nationality, Euro-Americans living up and down North America jockeyed for the lands of this valley. I don't even think that description adequately conveys what's going on. We have, therefore, the Susquehanna nations fighting for their independence against the Haudenosaunee and the British. We have the Haudenosaunee trying to resist that independence to protect their own lands, while at the same time the Ohio nations are claiming this area as their own. And then Pennsylvania claims it for themselves as part of the original purchase. And then, maybe, Connecticut claims it. So Connecticut says it has sea-to-sea rights from its charter, so Connecticut's going to send settlers there, and it's going to claim that as part of its colony. According to its sea-to-sea rights, the Connecticut colony goes all the way out to the Pacific. Connecticut maybe would like that now, I don't know. So this creates a really combustible situation in the Northern Susquehanna River Valley, and I didn't even get to it. And I'm in Virginia, right, so I have to say Virginia. Virginia's laying claim to half of Pennsylvania as well. And some of that claim, although it looks like it's the Virginia district goes below that, the Virginia district actually goes up by the West Branch. So Virginia's laying claim to much of that as well. Then, if we're going to the 7 Years' War, the French claim it. And the French want to establish a fort at Shamokin, down there, at Fort Augusta. Do you see how confusing this might be for people that are living there? It's bewildering. It's bewildering to even tell you. Right? Now, all these people that are trying to struggle for this land. So maybe we can start to recognize, therefore, why this becomes so messy and why an historical marker can't adequately tell that story. Right? Some of the major people and their stories that I tell in the book, again, while a complex topic, I tell through stories of the people who experienced it. And some may be familiar. Maybe. Like Tediuscung, or Tediuscung's son, Captain Bull, who were displaced from the Lehigh Valley because of the walking purchase. And eventually, are we going to get there? Maybe. If I push it too much, it's just going to go really far. There we go. Tediuscung, so you have Nutimus, Tediuscung, and Captain Bull. They're displaced 4 times to the Northern Susquehanna River Valley. And then Tediuscung is assassinated by settlers, and his son, Captain Bull, moves to the West Branch. And what I'm trying to say by that, sort of they go from Trenton, New Jersey, to the Lehigh Valley, to up near the Minnesink, over to the Wyoming on the East Branch, and then finally that family is over on the West Branch. You think about how many removes that is and what Less than 30 years? And I hope that by that simple story of displacement, we can see the interconnectedness of the Northern Susquehanna River Valley and the West Branch with a much larger and longer history, and therefore the power, I think, and this is something we often forget, of generational grievances and experiences that are informing decisions that people make and made. Captain Bull certainly thought so. But today, I think such broad strokes, while capturing the trajectory of the book, are inadequate. So as left with our time, I'm going to focus in on one little area that is a major part of the book, and that is the Tiadotin elm. Tiadotin, as a name for an elm tree, is a creative fiction. It would never have been called Tiadotin in 1776, and that's because Tiadotin is the name of a creek jutting off from the West Branch, the location of which was contested since at least 1768. In that year, there was, as one contemporary described, a great run for the lands on the Susquehanna. Settlers, speculators, military officers and soldiers, as well as different colonial governments, Pennsylvania and Connecticut, were all looking to claim the Susquehanna land. So too were the indigenous people. The Susquehanna nations had made that land their home after the destruction of Wyoming and the assassination of Tediascung. The Haudenosaunee were also looking to populate that same land with what they called their tributaries. The Iowa nations were also making the claim there. And the only thing holding back war was the Proclamation Line of 1763. How many of you have ever heard of that, the Proclamation Line? Well, in 1763, King George III made a proclamation line that would sweep through the Allegheny Mountains, but really, in Pennsylvania's case, it goes to the east side of the Northern Susquehanna River Valley. And that was barring colonial settlement and speculative purchases west, and that was holding that land for indigenous land. And that ended wars, like Pontiac's War, for example. But the proclamation line was contested. Pennsylvania's proprietors, the Penns, and Connecticut's government resisted the line. Squatters were a perennial problem, and intercolonial and transatlantic speculative companies that included such revolutionary luminaries as Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Patrick Henry, as well as key imperial agents such as Sir William Johnson and George Croghan, claimed the proclamation line not only foolhardy, but temporary. At the same time, powerful Pennsylvania speculators, such as the Chief Justice of the province, William Allen, as well as the Speaker of the Pennsylvania Assembly, Joseph Galloway, along with a host of prominent families, the Shippens and the Francises, were also looking to find a way around the line. So while historians typically look at the Ohio Territory, the Northern Susquehanna River Valley is just as important. Sir William Johnson and Thomas Penn, they're up top, and that's Elephant Dyer from the Connecticut Company down below. They were actively looking to move the line. And they argued that it was necessary to evade war, and also they pitched it to the British government that you could come out of the 1760s with an empire intact and financially unscathed if you just give the colonies more land. This will bar war with native peoples, and etc. But Johnson had another goal in mind. Johnson's office, he almost lost it because the new Secretary for the American Colonies, Lord Hillsborough, was actively looking to dismiss his office and the alliances with the Haudenosaunee. And Johnson's whole career is based on elevating the status of the Haudenosaunee over a host of territories. And so when he brings together the Haudenosaunee at Fort Stanwix in 1768, he lets them speak for all of those indigenous nations I represented earlier. And they agree to a new boundary for the proclamation line, pushing the line west. And this is where Tiadotta comes in. According to the new boundary line, on the West Branch, this is exactly what Thomas Penn wanted too. The new boundary line was going to go through Tiadotta Creek and then up a series of hills called Burnett's Hills. And you should be saying when you look at this right now that, well, that doesn't go through Tiadotta Pearl, that goes through something else. And that's because, which is interesting, this is a reproduction map done in the 19th century. And by the 19th century, the Tiadotta as a creek, the name, the state government moved it on purpose. And I'm going to talk about why they moved it today and what that means. The problem with this line is, and which was established in the treaty, is that It is unclear from this map, and this map is very wrong, by the way. That's not what the West Branch looks like. It is unclear on the map what is Tiadata, because Tiadata was not actually used very often. It is an indigenous word that was not used. However, this is the base map, Lewis's Evans map. There's only 3 creeks. You look at the 3 creeks on the West Branch, large and small, that could be Tiadata. And while one is labeled Tiadatan here, it's very rare. Well, which one is that? The problem is there are 7 creeks, large and small, jutting off from the West Branch. Some are claiming that Tiadata is Lycoming Creek, while the others claim that it is Pine Creek. That's a big deal. That's over 20 miles of land. And a lot of settlements in between, which we already saw on that map from William Clapham. The real proof, however, where Tiadata is that it is Lycoming Creek. And the reason that it's Lycoming Creek is we know a few things. One, when Conrad Weiser treaded that creek to go up to Onondaga in 1736, he called it, in his mixed German and English, Diadoctu, which has a phonetic similarity, but also geographic similarities as well. 2, when Thomas Penn ordered agents to go out and demarcate the line, the indigenous nations that were with him pointed to Lycoming Creek as Tiadata. That should be proof. But then, maybe, we also have other evidence. Here is a speculator's journal. He's also a veteran from the 7 Years' War. He writes very clearly that Lacomic is the Tiadatan, thus showing the boundary of the 1768 purchase. This matters because a host of speculators and squatters and colonial agents don't want to accept that Lycoming Creek is Tiadatan. They want to push it that 20 miles. And in the confusion, settlers will take advantage of it. And we can see pretty clearly here, if I can get this working. It's a bit slow, this one, because the images are so large. Whoops. Well, in any event, if you can see on that West Branch of the Fairplay, it went too far, see? I pushed it way too many times. It's just going through it now. All right. I don't know. I'm just going to leave it alone. In any event, if you can see, if you think about that line, the reason that it was so important was that that all of these people were trying to access it and control it. And so we have to think about why would, I'm back to where I want to be. The gods have spoken. Thank you. I like this. I'm not even going to touch it now. All right, so what's going on in this case? So why do we have all these settlers taking advantage of this situation? And I think that the problem that we need to think about is that the legal process to acquire the land after Fort Stanwix was stacked against the general public in favor of speculators. In fact, a group of socially and politically connected speculators, as well as a large group of military officers, were granted the ability to both apply for and send surveyors out to what they called the new purchase before any of the public could actually apply. So, for instance, the head of the land office, James Tillman, secretly opened the office to gentlemen appliers and military officers late in the evening around midnight on February 3rd, 1769, on a Sunday night, opened it up without advertisement to gentlemen and officers. Those gentlemen and officers gobbled up, this is about 35 of them, gobbled up more than 70,000 acres. 70,000 acres. And that does not even account for some rather shadowy dealings by some others who did it illegally. Speculators who tried to take what they had and play it off as it's on the West Branch. Frontier inhabitants who heard about what happened in the new purchase were unsurprisingly angry. After traveling about Pennsylvania's frontier, William Smith, an Anglican minister and proprietary ally, informed Thomas Penn that Tillman's policies had created, quote, monopolies, which have run in so narrow a channel among a few interested favorites that they have raised great clamor. Similarly, Edmund Physick, he traveled to Lancaster to collect taxes, noted that, quote, the inhabitants were greatly affected and he heard many of the complaints of the people. According to Physic, inhabitants, quote, remembered an advertisement published a few years before, wherein proprietaries expressed great abhorrence of monopolies. Due to these seemingly official sentiments, those frontier inhabitants couldn't understand why, quote, military officers and other private gentlemen were able to monopolize land in the new purchase. And this petition here, which is from 63 back inhabitants, they all articulating that feeling. Having long labored during the difficulty of a long and tedious Indian war, being frontiers and straitly bounding, enjoying but small tracts of land and mostly barrening ground, they thought that, quote, Providence had opened a door for the relief of poor people by a late purchase made from the Indian tribes. The purchase on Fort Stanwix, quote, imparted us great joy to think we had relief so nigh at hand. That joy vanished after they learned that the whole of the best of the said purchase betwixt military officers and other private gentlemen is wholly taken up. To make matters worse, those gentlemen were already advertising land for sale that we are not of the ability to buy. And then they could plead with the governor. None of us, they wanted him to take our deplorable condition under your most wise consideration, as none of us is endeavoring for more than one tract in said purchase, and is ready and willing to make the honorable proprietor's restitution for said lands. Out of the 58 known signatories, 34 of them applied for land in the new purchase when the land office opened to the public in April. Surprisingly, only 7 of these applicants were granted land. They received, all applicants, total 2,521 acres. Far less than what they had requested. So for perspective, these 31 applicants sought just over half the land that just one gentleman received in February, but only received about 15% total of what he got. Additionally, when the office opened to the public, speculators still gained the upper hand. The Shippen family, for instance, secured over twice the land acquired by these 31 applicants. The ramifications of such a scenario were clear. Some of the petitioners called it quits and joined Connecticut in its fight against Pennsylvania, such as Lazarus Stewart, the ringleader of the infamous Paxton Boys. Others, such as the Walkers and about 13 other families, made their way to that confusing territory there past Tayadot and Elm. And when they got there, they left, and this is the really important thing, they went as communities and extended families. It wasn't just like random people moving to the West Branch. And they believed, according to their petition, that they were going there so that the poor people could collect together to support themselves. They didn't have the manpower and resources to go on their own. And so they made their way there, as they said, to this then back country because we were then poor. And they arrive on the land of those indigenous nations that have been fighting for so long for their independence. By 1775, there are about 150 families living west of Lycoming Creek. It gets so bad that Native nations start making their way to Philadelphia, demanding the Penns to remove them, because it gives great offense to the entire nations. And they are threatening war if he doesn't. The governor of Pennsylvania issues proclamations barring settlement. He even threatens to execute the settlers, but they keep coming. By the time we get to about mid-1775, a sheriff arrives, and he notices that the proclamations have failed and the indigenous nations are running off the people from the West Branch. They are fleeing, making small little forts along the West Branch to the south side. One of those persons fleeing was James Hamilton, the guy from the beginning that said he had a great desire to kill an Indian. And that language, that idea, was reflected in the way that they described the American Revolution. They said, we will give our all, not only against the British Army, but against a cruel and savage enemy. And they believed that they were doing because Providence had opened the door to relief of poor people finally, and that they were helping the common cause against the perfidy of their savage enemy. Later, they don't even call the American Revolution as the American Revolution, the War of Independence. They call it the Late Unhappy Indian War. And this is how they remember it, and this is how it is reflected. And that language comes directly from what they were given in 1776. And this is where I'm going to kind of end today, so just bear with me. I know I've talked too long already. But in 1776, they do collect together on the banks of Pine Creek. And the reason we know that is because the Continental Congress incorporated the fair play territory into the resistance effort. They gave them representation on new committees, the committees of safety and committees of observation and inspection, that was propelling the resistance movement forward. In May of 1776, it looked like independence would never be declared. Pennsylvania was actually standing in the way. Richard Henry Lee from Virginia, John and Sam Adams from New England, from Massachusetts, they come up with a plan to dissolve Pennsylvania's colonial government, to get John Dickinson out of the way, which worked. To declare that Pennsylvania's government was ill-suited and that a new government needed to be erected on its stead. There's a circular letter that comes out from Philadelphia. I'm hoping I can get this up, but it doesn't really matter. A circular letter that comes out from Philadelphia. It's sent to all the committees. It makes its way to the West Branch. And in that circular letter from the Philadelphia Committee to those on the West Branch, the proprietary and the people. Who can recollect with the horrors of the late Indian War and not shudder at the idea it brings to his mind? Fire, sword, desolation, and death, and in the most infernal forms will be presented to our view. Parents and children weltering in their blood, infants torn with savage brutality from their mother's wombs and made the food of dogs. And these horrid ravages of that dreadful war were long permitted to spread through this devoted province by means of the unjust claims of the haughty and absolute proprietaries. To rid yourselves forever of their tyranny is now in your power. If you embrace it, your descendants will glory in their ancestors. If you neglect it, you will entail slavery on your posterity, and they will justly execrate your memory as unworthy of a parent's name. Liberty and slavery is before you. Take then your choice. It's the same language that then the fair play settlers use to not only justify their revolution, but later claim that what they did in the war, they formed two units, what they did in the war justified the dispossession of the native nations who lived there and the rights to their once illegal claims. And they achieve it. By 1783, they are propped up by both Congress and the states as heroes of the revolution who have suffered and died and sacrificed for the common cause. And this has reverberations well beyond the time period of how they remember and how they think about the revolution, and therefore the meaning of the revolution itself. So in 1930, and I promise this is where I end. I keep saying that. I'm long-winded. So the grandson of a fair play settler in 1930, he was remembering and reflecting on the, quote, glorious service of his grandfather. His grandfather was interviewed in 1836 by the local papers who touted him a famous, quote, Indian killer. His knife is on display at the Tabor Museum in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, in which it has 13 notches representing Native peoples he killed during Sullivan's campaign and Hartley's expedition. But the way that this grandson remembered it was that my grandfather secured my home from Indians who wanted to take away the land from the whites. Similarly, the granddaughter of a Nanticoke family displaced from the Susquehanna River Valley during the war to Canada, but who continued to see the West Branch as home, a place that her family once lived, could not understand, quote, why can't we come back here to live where our people have been buried? That's in 1836 as well. And I don't offer such an incomplete end as a teaser to get you to sort of read my book. That would be a welcome result, by the way. I'm just playing. But I am my talk here to emphasize the place and power of not just the land, but the generational grievances, experiences, and memories that not only defined but continue to redefine the American Revolution. Thank you for bearing with me and listening to this story. And I'll take any questions.
Thank you for your talk. I am a middle school teacher for young boys. How might we best try to capture this idea of land and its disputes in kind of a simple way? The story is really beautiful, but how do we kind of summarize that?
No, that's a fabulous question, because I have to think about that too, even with college kids, right? Right, because I live this. Like I'm in the documents, and I'm sort of like, and I can get very trees oriented rather than forest. Very minute. But I think one of the things that we need to do, and when we think about it, is like, okay, there's land, but it's not as vast as one imagines. So if we give a map of the United States, we're like, look how big this is. But we have to consider, right, like, what's the settlement of North America in 1763? It's very much clinging to the eastern seaboard. We also have to consider the strength and power of indigenous nations. And we need to take that seriously, not just because it's necessary to include them in this day and age, but in reality, they were very important to the process. So I'll give you one example. In 1790, there's a murder right there on the West Branch. George Washington has to get involved. They force his hands because he's afraid to go to war with the Seneca, because he's already facing the Shawnee. Right? So just thinking about indigenous nations and their place in power. Third thing that I would bring up, who has access to land? Why do you need land? Right? Well, the population of colonial North America is doubling every 20 years. Doubling. It's extending westward. A typical farm family, and if you can take this from me, this is kind of what I use. A typical farm family needs 150 acres of land, and that's not all cleared, just for survival, just to break even. That's a lot of land, 150 acres, can you imagine? It seems a lot to us, but it's actually very small to them. And what we see instead is that large speculators are gobbling up most of this. And it's making it very difficult for people to receive land. And if it's a fight over land, are you going to try to fight it out with middling farmers? Like, if you're a squatter, are you going to squat on middling farmland, like of middling farmers? Or are you going to squat on unlocated land to the west that's beyond the reach of speculators and governments looking to remove you? And if they find you on, it's like speculator land, they will burn down your homes. So they sort of, it's like a ripple effect. Think of it like a stone thrown in a pond, right? That reverberation outside of that. So they keep, every time there's a new deal and new purchases, they keep settling beyond that line. And I think that's the way to understand it. But you also have to, I would love to do, like in a middle school, is to think about how indigenous people use the land and how much land you need. Right, because we say 150 acres for a normal farm, but if it's an indigenous territory, you need fowling locations, you need hunting land, you need reclamation land, you also need thousands of acres of farmland. And even like hunting is conscious cultivation. So you need the existing undergrowth to actually have wild herbivores. And so what you do is you move your town every 10 to 20 years, so you need a larger sort of sovereign territory. You move your town every 20 years for natural reclamation, and that natural reclamation will bring back the wild herbivores that you would therefore hunt. And so they need that land too, for survival, for trade. I hope that answers the question, but I would pose those three things and just think about, like, why do you need land, and what's its purpose? Beyond the politics of it. Yeah, I hope that's answers. Yeah, go ahead.
You showed a map early on of the West Branch with several indigenous communities on the tributaries. I'm imagining that those communities were constantly in flux based on this contention. So the same people that were there at that particular moment in time may be very different. Plus, indigenous tribes often were seasonal. They didn't necessarily live in one place all year long. So can you describe a little bit more what was happening just with those communities on that stretch of the West Branch over a period of, say, 20 or 30 years? There's a lot of movement, right?
Yeah. There's a lot of movement, seasonal variation. So the hunting season is about 6 months at any given year. And the hunting season is not, it typically is depicted as just men, but it's not. The women go with the men because they have to tan the hides and et cetera. Okay? And they're also the ones that are trading the material. So there is that sort of variation. But what I would say, do you mind if, well, I don't have a microphone, but if we're looking at this area here, okay? Think of it as a larger territorial zone, all right? When you're thinking about the movement of indigenous people in the Northern Susquehanna River Valley, you're not talking about the movement of, say, down here. For instance, down here is Muncie Creek, okay? There's Loyalsock, there's Lake Holman. Now, if I look at that and I'm thinking, well, what's the settlement patterns? What's the actual movement, right? We're not talking they're moving 100 miles away for the hunting season. They're moving like 20, 30 miles, right? So you want to think of an area as a territorial zone in which people are moving within. Yes, there's some fluctuation because some are just giving up because it's just like this constant barrage of settlers. And so they move out to the Ohio River Valley. Some will move north into like places like Tioga, for instance. But many of them try to remain within those territorial zones into what they're trying to articulate as their own land. So even though you're like variation of like, that town's not there, that one, it says Margaret, that town's not there in 1765 in that exact place. But that does not mean that that town does not exist within that territorial zone. You see what I'm saying? And so that's kind of what I'm talking about. Some leaders will come and go, but there is a lot of generational living, especially between 49 to 76, 77, right? That young woman that she was older at the time I was talking about at the end, her name is Wei Wei. And her family was brought to the Susquehanna in the 1750s, and then moved again because of 68. And then moved again because of Sullivan's expedition. They end up in Avon, New York, in the Sulphur Springs. But they had lived in that territorial zone, even with those dispossessions and displacements, for 30 years, right? And I get what you're saying, but that's how I would answer it. I'm like, oh, that town's not there, but the town's just up the river, right? And those kin groups are still there. I hope that answers the question.
I had a question in regards to the question that the middle school teacher had. Is there a map that shows the land that the land speculators claimed or owned?
No. There is pieces. There is one, and I'll show you just maybe. If I can get this thing. I'm not very good with this, apparently. Can you do me a favor? Go one. Another one. Another one. Keep going till you get to that map that has the Lacomic on it. One more. One more. I put a lot of slides in here. And they're only long-winded. I apparently like images. Right here. Okay. If you look at this map here, do you see those lines on the map? This is a draft of the Susquehanna taken by Captain Patterson. He was one of those gentlemen, military officers that was trying to speculate in land. So these are all the officers' claims. Do you see how it goes all the way up the West Branch, up to about Muncie Creek around Penn's Manor lands, and then all the way down there it says officers' grants? So they're taking all the good farmable land that's available. That's about 13 guys. One guy, his name is Turbot Francis. He gets 5,000 acres up by just a bit south of Muncie Creek. That is now currently the town of Turbotville, right? So this is the closest thing I can get you to a map of all those speculative purchases, and that's just 13 of them. You'd have to go, and I went to the Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission, and I looked at all the surveys to try to piece together other parts of the map, but it's very difficult with the special grants. I hope that answers your question, but this is one of the best ones that we have to showcase, what some speculators are doing. Also, just a reminder, if you look at the claim there on the river, if you go, West of that, it's mountains, right? Any other questions?
Could you sort of give us a broader look of what happened in this area during the French and Indian War and during the Revolutionary War, in terms of what Indian tribes sided with the French and what Indian tribes sided with the British?
Yeah, I can totally do that for you. So if we're looking at this area here on the West Branch, this is the home of the Susquehanna Nations. They claim about 2 million acres in the area. That's the Lenape, Shawnee, Nanticoke, Kenoi, Saponi, Tutelo, Mohican, Esopus. The Haudenosaunee as well live there. Mostly Seneca, Cayuga, Tuscarora. Some Oneida live in the area. There's an Oneida headman at Shamokin named Shikellamy. But it becomes very fractured in the 7 Years' War. So the Haudenosaunee, they stay neutral, essentially, during the war. Some of the Seneca are veering toward the French because they think the French are in their best interest. The Susquehanna Nations initially try to stay neutral during the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, because, I mean, you don't want to stake your life and land on a loser, right? And so you're kind of trying to figure out what's going on. Well, by 1755, the Susquehanna Nations, the Lenape, and et cetera, they decide that they're going to war. And what's really fascinating about what they do is when they go to war, they don't attack people along the West Branch or the East Branch. They actually go back to their homelands in the Lehigh Valley. They attack Northampton County. They attack parts of Bucks, right? And it's in an effort to remove people from the land that they had once called home, right? And that's a really fascinating reality. So the Susquehanna Nation side with the French. Revolution's way more complicated. Parts of the Haudenosaunee go with the British, so the Seneca, Mohawk, Cayuga, the Oneida and the Tuscarora, they stay, and well, they align mostly, though there's a civil war there, align mostly with the Americans. There's a reason for that. And then the Onondaga try to stay neutral. But for a really long time, many of the native nations, even for the Haudenosaunee, want to stay neutral. Then if you look at the Susquehanna Nations, they quickly join the war effort with the British. And I think what I would point out, and what I try to point out in the book, they're not British allies or tributaries, right? They are making choices based on what they see as their own individual futures. They don't really care, I don't think, in the long run, what happens to the British, as long as it means the survival and sovereignty of their own nations. So even the Lenape are kind of looking out and saying, well, can the Americans provide this, or can the British? And there's this really interesting case that I show in the book. There's a Lenape chief. His name is White Eyes. And White Eyes decides that he thinks that the Lenape need to side with the Americans. The Americans make him a captain in the Continental Forces, and he's marching out to Detroit when the Pennsylvania militia kill him. Because any Native American is an enemy Native American at that point, and that's all populated in the newspapers. Well, once White Eyes is killed by American soldiers, Lenape, Shawnee, they flip, and they go for the British side. And so it's much messier, and I try to describe that in the book as a civil war, right? And it's not just a civil war as we like to think about it for American colonists or American common citizens, because there are loyalists and et cetera, but it's also a civil war for the indigenous people. They're not, all of one mind, right? And so that's really important to sort of recognize. I hope that answers your question.
I think that's all we're going to have time for in terms of questions today, but I just want us all to give Christopher another big round of applause. That was a fantastic talk. And just as a quick reminder, Christopher is going to be in Commonwealth Hall in just a few moments, signing copies of the book, which is available in the gift shop if you took that cue, and he can certainly answer any more questions that you might have in Commonwealth Hall in just a few minutes. So thank you again for your support. Thanks for your attendance. And thank you, Christopher, for a wonderful lecture.
Thank you. And thank you all for putting up with me. I appreciate that.